Hi everyone, it's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is payment for ecosystem services. We're going to take a look at Costa Rica's approach. Now you're going to see that this is a pretty easy idea, but it's been instrumental in helping Costa Rica move in the direction of reforestation and sustainable development. And the idea is really well grounded in environmental economics. So we're going to be able to make a lot of connections here. Let's remind ourselves about deforestation in Costa Rica. We know that Costa Rica is now a leader in sustainability, but we need to remember that this was not always the case. Costa Rica has a history of deforestation. In fact, some of the highest rates of deforestation in the world, and I'm going to show you some maps that will make this very clear. The deforestation that we saw in Costa Rica was a result of governmental decisions that basically subsidized destruction. And that's a pretty common story when we look at deforestation around the world and destruction of rainforests, that a lot of it is incentivized by government. Why? Governments want to make way for development. They want export strength. And to do that, you've got to create room for things that do develop into strong exports. Of course, these actions were short-sighted, and Costa Rica paid the price, but they have learned from their mistakes, and now, of course, we know they're in a very different trajectory. It's taken much action on the part of Costa Rica to restore their natural environment. So you really need to think about how impressive it is for a developing country like this to have completely turned itself around. Clearly a success story. One contributor to deforestation was coffee, and we know that coffee grows really well in parts of Costa Rica, but coffee is also a very lucrative export. So if you're a country looking to develop export strength, coffee is a good way to do it. But unfortunately, land was cleared to make way for coffee. This is before we started talking about shade-grown coffee and those kinds of things. So you're clear-cutting land. Remember, we're in that Central Valley area. Another lucrative export was meat. Well, how do you get meat? You've got to do the same kind of thing. Clear land for ranching. So the bottom line is that government wanted to expand activities in these and other industries. Coffee, meat, gives you export strength, and it led to deforestation. The problem here is that government did incentivize this. How? Government gave land to anyone who would develop it. You just had to prove that you had developed it. And the bar was pretty low from what I'm reading. It didn't take very much for you to be able to say, oh, I've developed this land. In my reading, it suggested that it's as little as putting some cows on the land, maybe just even a couple of cows, and now you own the land and you have an incentive to clear it. Of course, logging was an additional problem, and we know that has led to deforestation, not just in Costa Rica, but in other forested areas as well. Quickly, Costa Rica lost large portions of its forest, really in a very short period of time. This map really tells the picture. Take a look. It's going from 1940 to 2010. If you go from 1940 to 1950 to 1960, 77, 83, 87, look at what's happening. You're seeing depletion of forests, and then it starts to turn itself around only after 1987. So between 1940 and 1987, if we take a look, the forest cover falls dramatically as a proportion of the country. Costa Rica went from being 75% of the nation forested to only 21% of the nation being forested. And think about it, guys, that's only a 37-year period of time. So incentivized by government, trying to economically develop, create export strength, coffee, meat, through logging activities, we see an enormous amount of damage done to Costa Rica and massive deforestation. As I said, some of the highest rates in the world. But 1990s began a new way of thinking, not just in Costa Rica, but globally. And this might have started with things like the 1992 United Nations Rio Summit And it had this major focus on sustainable development, not just for developed countries, but for developing and thinking more globally about the idea of sustainability. Then, of course, you had the Kyoto Protocol that brought high hopes with this massive goal of reducing emissions. It didn't quite come to fruition. But at the time, these were exciting things, and it stimulated ideas by conservationists in Costa Rica. And those conservationists that are, excited about what's going on in the world are asking themselves, how can they take action at home? What could Costa Rica do itself to start focusing on sustainable development while this kind of global movement towards sustainable development, at least back in the 90s, is starting to percolate? And of course, how can Costa Rica undo some of the damage that they've caused in their goal of trying to economically develop? This led to the 1996 forest law in Costa Rica, and this seems to really be a turning point for Costa Rica. The 1996 forest law makes protection and conservation of forests a priority. Again, massive deforestation. It's going to take some legislation and some action and some resources to turn this around. One of the things this law does is it bans deforestation countrywide. And this was not just on public government-owned land, but on private lands too. So this 1996 law says it's time to get serious about reforestation, and protecting our forests. We're going to ban deforestation, not just on government-owned lands, but on private land as well, right? And that's pretty novel, because otherwise you would have had the right to do what you want to do on your own land. After all, you own it. Another thing that this 1996 law does is establishes payments for ecosystem services. And that's really what we want to focus on, this idea of payments for ecosystem services. Before we jump into this, let's make sure we all are on the same page, because we have different backgrounds. Ecosystem services, what do we mean by that? Well, if we define ecosystem services, taking one of the most common definitions, you see that it's defined as the direct and indirect contributions of ecosystems to human well-being. The direct and indirect contributions of ecosystems to human well-being. All right, so we're basically talking about what services do ecosystems give to us as humans that improve our well-being. So you can imagine things like in creating more oxygen and being a carbon sink, removing carbon from the environment. Those would be ecosystem services. And of course, they have an impact on our survival and quality of life. So these are services that come from the ecosystem that affect the quality of life for human beings. So that's what we mean by ecosystem services. If we're talking about payment for ecosystem services, well, now we're talking about a voluntary transaction between a service buyer and a service seller that takes place on the condition that either a specific ecosystem service is provided or land is used in a way to secure that service. Okay, so that's a lot of words. Let's pick it apart. So first, a voluntary transaction. So this is me as a landowner choosing. I'm not being told I have to do this. I'm not being forced to get into this arrangement, but we're going to basically come to an agreement. So it's a voluntary transaction between a service buyer. Now in this case, this might be government in Costa Rica because they're buying ecosystem services from service sellers. Who's the service seller? The landowner. So this is a voluntary arrangement made between, in Costa Rica, the government and a landowner that takes place on the condition that either a specific ecosystem service is provided, so we're going to say you must provide us this service, or more likely in Costa Rica's case, land is used in a way to secure that service. So in this case, it would be we're going to pay the landowner so that the landowner uses his land in a way that generates this ecosystem service. Very simple. We're paying people for ecosystem services that their land can create, and they have to agree to things, and in return, they get a payment. So what we're talking about then in Costa Rica is that locals, and we're talking about landowners here, receive payments for protecting the forest instead of cutting it down. And that's an interesting idea. Pay people for the ecosystem service that their healthy forested land is going to provide. It's important to understand that people may care about the environment, and I'm not saying that people are cutting down trees because they don't care about the environment at all. But here's the thing. They can't afford to give up the activities that generate revenue, right? This is not a rich country. A rich person might be able to buy a parcel of forest and just keep it intact just for the value of having it intact. My brother's a good example. He's a doctor. He has bought a huge parcel of land. It's forested. It's beautiful. He's not going to deforest. He doesn't need to create a ranch or start farming it, right? But the problem is that in Costa Rica, prior to ecotourism, a standing forest just doesn't generate income in the marketplace, right? If you own forested land in Costa Rica before ecotourism, how do you make money on your standing forest? Well, you really can't. We say in environmental economics that living trees have no economic value in a lot of cases, and that's the problem. When you cut them down, you can sell the wood. When you cut them down, you can create a farm. This is the incentive problem that creates deforestation. But this payment for ecosystem services gives those standing trees, those living forests, a value. And that's what's great about this. It changes the incentive structure. This program is especially important in rural areas. Think about why that might be. You know, in rural areas, incomes are going to be lower, right? And your options are going to be limited. Rural areas don't give the same kind of opportunities that you would have if you were in the city. This creates a win-win situation, right? It benefits both the environment and the landowner. So payment for ecosystem services, mutually beneficial. The landowner wins, the environment wins, which means society wins. Also in my reading, I saw a number of reports that suggested that this system of payments for ecosystem services has actually helped address poverty. Although trying to alleviate poverty, of course, it's a goal of all developing countries, but that wasn't the goal of ecosystem services. So that was kind of a bonus, an unintended consequence. So another great outcome of having payments for ecosystem services. This idea is really well grounded in environmental economics. There are so many connections that I can make to what we teach in an environmental economics class. All of us benefit from an intact forest, right? You learned that probably in middle school, that having trees is good for everyone, right? Rainforests are considered to be the lungs of the earth. We need healthy rainforests, and while we have just about no rainforests in our country, we still benefit when Brazil has healthy forests, and we benefit when Costa Rica has healthy forests. They produce oxygen. They absorb carbon. They make the environment cleaner. So we all benefit from this. And so what we're saying is that rainforests create positive externalities, and not just small positive externalities. They create really big positive externalities, very important positive externalities. So landowners should be compensated for this service. Why should landowners have big restrictions imposed upon them to create benefits for the world, but have to do it as a contribution? That doesn't seem like it would be fair, right? Here's a great example that I found in my research for this presentation, and this is the story of Elicinio Flores. And Elicinio was granted a 10-hectare plot of land, and every time I talk about hectares, I have to look up the conversion. But 10 hectares would be almost 25 acres of land, and he was granted this land at the age of 22. Now remember, Costa Rica is granting land and giving away land to anyone who will develop it with this goal of trying to create economic export strength. So this was 1976, long before this movement towards sustainability in Costa Rica. When he received the land, it was untouched. It was raw. There are no roads. There's no drinking water. It is just forest. But as we just talked about, you could not make a living from the forest back in 1976. Now in Costa Rica, forests have value because ecotourism wants forests. People want to see a forest. They want to look for birds. They want to see the animals. But it was different back in 1976. You weren't having millions of tourists show up with the idea of touring a forest and going on a trek. So Elicinio couldn't make a living from the forest. What did he do? He cleared the trees and he started to raise cattle because that's what this government land grant program was all about. He decided later to preserve 5 hectares. So you're talking about a little over 10, 12 acres. And then he decided to replant 2 more hectares. So this is a pretty significant portion of his overall land. And as part of this current program, Payment for Ecosystem Services, Elicinio receives $64 per hectare per year for basic forest protection. And there are different kinds of activities, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, nor do I have all the information about the different kinds of payments and amounts. Now, could he make more raising cattle? Probably so. However, he does get to supplement his income from payments for ecosystem services because part of this program allows landowners to selectively harvest the timber. And that's going to add to his income. And when I say selectively harvest timber, Elicinio and landowners like him are guided on which trees are not vital to the ecosystem. And so he gets educated on which trees can come down and be sold, which ones need to remain. So he's allowed to do a little thinning out of his land. And so the combination of the $64 per hectare and being able to sell off timber, it's apparently worth it because he's participating in this program. Again, remember, it's voluntary, so you're only going to do it if you feel it makes you better off or you enjoy participating. Between years 2000 and 2020, I found a statistic that explained that the Costa Rican government has paid out $500 million to landowners. So keep in mind that this isn't nonprofit organizations. This is government making this payment to the landowners. And by doing this, Costa Rica is saving more than 1 million hectares of forest, which would be something like 2.47 million acres of forested land. And that's 1/5 of the country. So this is pretty substantial. This $500 million investment has led to protection of a very large portion of the country's forested land. Also, it's resulted in planting more than 7 million trees because, again, there's going to be some incentive programs for reforestation as well, not just protecting your forest, but trying to reforest other parcels. How does Costa Rica fund all of this? Well, Costa Rica uses what economists call green taxes to fund the program. And the specific green tax that is being used is a tax on fossil fuels. Well, that seems really logical. Let's tax something bad to do something good. Now, in economics, we would refer to this particular green tax, the tax on fossil fuels, as a fiscal tax. A fiscal tax. A fiscal tax raises revenue. Think about this. There's not a lot of substitutes for fossil fuels, right? Think about gasoline in our country. If we tax gasoline, can people just substitute away from gasoline? No. So think about what's going to happen. We can tax things like gasoline, And people cannot cut back a lot. They could cut back a little bit, right? Carpool, don't take unnecessary trips. They can buy more fuel efficient cars, but the reality is that people can't cut back a lot on fossil fuels. I can try to use less electricity in my house, but at the end of the day, there's not a lot of substitutes unless you find ways to completely change technologies, solar power, electric cars. So instead, when we tax fossil fuels, people continue to consume the good and pay the tax. Again, they don't have a lot of choice. So think about what's going to happen. It means that the tax on fossil fuels is a good tax instrument if the goal is to raise money. Is Costa Rica's goal to raise money here? Yeah, it is. That's why we call this a fiscal tax. A fiscal tax is a tax that's imposed with the goal of raising money. And the tax on fossil fuels does just that. But I want to also explain the opposite. At other times, we impose what economists call an incentive tax. So we just talked about a fiscal tax. A fiscal tax is imposed on something where the goal is to generate revenue because you know people are going to pay it. But at other times, we impose an incentive tax. And an incentive tax, when we do that, the idea is to make an environmentally damaging activity more expensive. We're going to tax something to make it more expensive, but what we're trying to do is give people an incentive to substitute away. We're giving people an incentive to substitute away, hence the term incentive tax. We're creating an incentive to substitute away. But people have to be able to substitute, right? If they can substitute away, our goal then might be realized, to have less of the damaging activity. We want to have less of this damaging activity. So with an incentive tax, the goal is to create an incentive so that people don't do this as much, and it's not about raising revenue. Now, with the fossil fuel tax, clearly Costa Rica needs to raise revenue, so they need a fiscal tax, but at other times they might create an incentive tax. Here's an example. If we put significant taxes on plastic bags at grocery stores, we would have an incentive tax. And there are countries that have done this. Ireland has done this. Think about it. If we would do this at Walmart, people would change their behavior, right? Everyone agree that when it comes to bags at grocery stores, people have options, and it's pretty easy to move away from plastic bags. How do you do that? You just bring your own. Hence, we have an incentive tax. People are going to respond to the tax. They've got options. They can substitute very easily. And we are going to reduce the use of plastic bags. And that's exactly what has happened in Ireland. They've all but eliminated use of these plastic bags that we then often throw into the trash can. The fossil fuel tax that we've been talking about for Costa Rica has what economists call a polluter pays approach to it. So this is another reason that economists like fossil fuel taxes. What do I mean by a polluter pays approach? What we're saying is that we're going to tax something that is harmful to the environment. In other words, those people who pollute should pay the bill. So by taxing something harmful to the environment, the polluter pays. And with lack of substitutes, like with fossil fuels, it's a good way to generate revenue, as we've talked about. So fossil fuels taxes use a polluter pays approach. Those that are creating the pollution should have to pay for it. So by putting the tax on fossil fuels, we get that. So fossil fuel taxes are fiscal taxes that have a polluter pays approach. We know it's going to generate revenue. But here's the thing. It's going to generate revenue now while fossil fuel use in Costa Rica is high. So right now, Costa Rica can generate a lot of revenue from the fossil fuels tax. But Costa Rica has some very ambitious goals. They have a goal of being net zero emissions by 2050. And that's not that far down the road, right? So Costa Rica has a very ambitious goal to be net zero emissions by 2050. If you don't know what we mean by net zero emissions, let's explain that. When we talk about net zero emissions, we're saying that there's a balance between the greenhouse gases produced and what is removed from the atmosphere. So in net, it balances out, it adds to zero. Does this mean Costa Rica doesn't generate any greenhouse gases? No. It's saying that it has to be offset by removing emissions from the atmosphere. So net zero means whatever destructive activities there are, and of course they're trying to remove a lot of that, has to be offset by removal and absorption of emissions from the atmosphere. Easier to do if you can get your emissions way down. So Costa Rica has this very lofty goal of net zero emissions by 2050. And as I just said, that's going to require getting emissions down. How do you get emissions down? Well, it requires transportation to be converted to electricity. And we're talking about public transportation and private transportation, not just public. What's the problem here then? What happens to your fossil fuel tax? In the future, the fossil fuel tax is not going to generate a whole lot of money. There won't be as much consumption of fossil fuels to tax, right? This means that government will have to find tax alternatives in the future. And they have a little while, but I'm sure they're already thinking long term about what are we going to do to continue being able to pay for ecosystem services, and what can we use as a tax instrument to generate that money for making these financial payments. Costa Rica's program is really innovative. Again, they're not the only people to do it, but I want you to appreciate that they did this back in the 90s. They're a developing nation. And they weren't as rich then back in the late 90s as they are now. And again, they're not rich, but they have moved a long way. And we've seen the data on gross domestic product per capita, right? This is a country that is an economic success story. But they've decided to make a major investment in sustainability. They have created this nationwide green ethic, this nationwide focus on sustainability, and that's pretty amazing for a developing country. But I do want to point out that the United States has similar types of programs. I tried to find more recent data and didn't have a lot of luck, but I did find a 2011 report that indicated that at that time, almost $2 billion had been paid out, $1.9 billion. Again, it's more now because that study's a little bit old, but there's a lot of money that's being paid in the form of ecosystem services. And the report suggested that this is likely an underestimate, but it's still a lot of money. But here's the rub. Here's the thing I want you to understand that makes it different than Costa Rica. In the United States, at least according to this report more than a decade ago, more than 80% of the funding for payments for ecosystem services came from non-government sources. In other words, it's not our federal government paying $2 billion. Instead, we're seeing a lot of this come from private sources. So in Costa Rica, the government is fitting the bill for this huge amount of money being paid for ecosystem services, but we see a bit more decentralization in the United States. Let me give you an example. The example I want to give you is Longwood University's Hull Springs Farm. Now, first, let's be clear. Hull Springs Farm is owned by the Real Estate Foundation, which means it's private. Longwood University is a public institution, but we've established this private foundation, and that allows us to acquire property without going through the same governmental processes. Hull Springs Farm is a beautiful farm that's on the Chesapeake Bay, and Longwood received it because it was in somebody's will that this facility be donated to the university. And we've done some really innovative things at Hull Springs Farm. One of the things that we're doing at Hull Springs Farm is that we're engaged in mitigation banking, mitigation banking. What that means is that environmental projects are undertaken at Hull Springs Farm, and the idea of the mitigation banking is that it creates these credits that Longwood accrues, and then they can sell. So when we talk about mitigation banking, that means that Longwood can make investments in environmental projects there at Hull Springs Farm, which is right there on the Chesapeake Bay, and in return for the investment that Longwood is making, they receive a credit. Now, why does Longwood want the credit? Because they can sell them. You might be thinking, who would want to buy this kind of credit? Well, any business that has to undertake restorative projects. If you're a business and you have to undertake restorative projects, well, you can buy credits from somebody else instead of doing them yourself. So maybe you're a contractor and you're developing land, but you have to have some restorative projects. You're basically buying the credits from Longwood's Hull Spring Farms, which means Longwood is doing the restorative project instead of you. So buy the credits from Longwood. It's a win-win, right? Longwood gets money from the credits, and the businessman, for example, a contractor, doesn't have to undertake these restorative projects himself or herself. This is an interesting idea, but this is the kind of thing that we're doing more of in the United States. Economists like this. It creates a win-win, but it's not the government making a payment, right? In this example here, it's a private developer paying Hull Springs Farm. So that is a little different than what we're talking about in terms of payment for ecosystem services in Costa Rica, where the money is coming from government. Either way, this creates incentives for environmental projects, whether the money is coming between private entities like a developer and the Longwood Real Estate Foundation, or money is going from Costa Rica government to private landowners. Incentivizing it is what is the key. Costa Rica has reforested. It's been a success story of reforestation. If you look online, you can find tons of articles talking about the reforestation efforts and how it's considered to be a model of success. If we look at Costa Rica now, 51% of the country is forested. So they've undone a lot of that damage that we saw earlier. But here's the thing. Because of deforestation, less than 1/4 of this is primary forest. That means when we're trekking in Costa Rica, we're likely going to be in secondary forested, the result of reforestation, and not primary forests. But either way, they are beautiful. Costa Rica also protects more than 25% of its land in reserves. So Costa Rica has very ambitiously created reserves, and they are protecting them. Of course, this helps Costa Rica attract tourists, as you know, especially for ecotourism. If you don't have healthy forests, people aren't coming. If your forests aren't intact, you can't see beautiful toucans, you can't see sloths, and people are going to choose other destinations. So this has been a really good strategy for economic development for Costa Rica, and we'll be talking more about it. If you have any questions, please let me know. I thank you for listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day.